Chapter 27. My dear Mr. Pip, I write this by request of Mr. Gargery, for to let you know that he is going to London in company of Mr. Wopsle, and would be glad, if agreeable, to be allowed to see you. He would call at Barnard's Hotel Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, when, if not agreeable, please send word. Your poor sister is much the same as when you left. We talk of you in the kitchen every night and wonder what you're saying and doing. If now considered in the light of a liberty, please excuse it for the love of poor old days. No more, Mr. Pip, from your ever obliged and affectionate servant, Biddy. P.S. He wishes me most particular to write what larks. He says you will understand. I hope and do not doubt it will be agreeable to see him, even though a gentleman, for you ever had a good heart, and he is a worthy, worthy man. I have read him all, excepting only the last little sentence, and he wishes me most particular to write again what larks. I received this letter by the post on Monday morning, and therefore its appointment was for the next day. Let me confess exactly with what feelings I looked forward to Joe's coming. Not with pleasure, though I was bound to him by so many ties. No. With considerable disturbance, some mortification, and a keen sense of incongruity. If I could have kept him away by paying money, I certainly would have paid money. My greatest reassurance was that he was coming to Barnard's Inn, not to Hammersmith, and consequently would not fall in with Bentley Drummle. I had little objection to him being seen by Herbert or his father, for both of whom I had respect, but I had the sharpest sensitiveness as to his being seen by Drummle, whom I held in contempt. So, throughout life, our worst weaknesses and meannesses are usually committed for the sake of the people we most despise. I had begun to be always decorating the chambers in some quite unnecessary and inappropriate way or other, and very expensive these wrestles with Barnard proved to be. By this time the rooms were vastly different from what I found them, and I enjoyed the honour of occupying a few prominent pages in the books of a neighbouring upholsterer. I had got on so fast of late that I had even engaged a servant. I started a boy of about 13 in boots, top boots, in bondage and slavery, to whom I might have been said to pass my days. For after I had made the monster out of the refuse of my washerwoman's family, and had clothed him with a blue coat, canary waistcoat, white cravat, creamy breeches, and the boots already mentioned, I had to find him a little to do and a great deal to eat. And with both of these horrible requirements he haunted my experience. The avenging phantom, the boy in other words, was ordered to be on duty at 8 on Tuesday morning in the hall. It was 2 feet square as charged for floor cloth. And Herbert suggested certain things for breakfast that he thought Joe might like. While I was sincerely obliged to him for being so interested and considerate, I had an odd half-provoked sense of suspicion upon me that if Joe had been coming to see him, he wouldn't have been quite so brisk as he was. However, I came into town on the Monday night to be ready for Joe, and I got up early in the morning and caused the sitting room and the breakfast table to assume their most splendid appearance. Unfortunately, the morning was drizzly, and an angel couldn't have concealed the fact that Barnard was shedding sooty tears outside the window like some weak giant of a chimney sweep. As the time approached, I should have liked to run away. But the boy, whom I called the Avenger, pursuant to orders, was in the hall, and presently I heard Joe on the staircase. I knew it was Joe by his clumsy manner of coming upstairs, his state boots always being too big for him, and by the time it took him to read the names on the other floors in the course of his ascent. When at last he stopped outside our door, I could hear his finger tracing out the painted letters of my name, and I afterwards distinctly heard him breathing in at the keyhole. Finally, he gave a faint single rap, and Pepper, such was the compromising name of the avenging boy, announced, "Mr. Gargery." I thought he never would have done wiping his feet, and then I must have gone out to lift him off the mat. But at last he came in. "Joe! How are you, Joe?" "Pip! How are you, Pip?" With his good honest face all glowing and shining and his hat put down on the floor between us, he caught both my hands and worked them straight up and down as if I'd been the last named pump. "I'm glad to see you, Joe. Give me your hat." But Joe, taking it up carefully with both hands, like a bird's nest with eggs in it, wouldn't hear of parting with that piece of property, and persisted in standing talking over it in a most uncomfortable way. "Which you have that growed," said Joe, "and that swelled, and that gentlefolked." Joe considered a little before he discovered this world, as I am sure, saying again, "You have growed. You are now a honour to your king and country." "And you, Joe, you look wonderfully well." "Thank God," said Joe. "I am equal to most. And your sister, she's no worse than she were, and Biddy, she's ever right and ready, and all friends is no backarder if no forwarder, except Wopsle. He's had a drop." All this time, still with both hands taking great care of the bird's nest, Joe was rolling his eyes round the room and round the flowered pattern on my dressing gown. "Had a drop, Joe?" "Why, yes," said Joe, lowering his voice. "He's left the church and gone into play-actin', which the play-actin' have likewise brought him to London along of me. And his wish were," said Joe, getting the bird's nest under his left arm for the moment and groping in it for an egg with his right, "if no offence, as I would give you this." I took what Joe gave me and found it to be a crumpled playbill of a small metropolitan theatre announcing the first appearance in that very week of the celebrated provincial amateur of Roshan renown, whose unique performance in the highest tragic walk of our national bard has lately occasioned so great a sensation in local dramatic circles. "Were you at his performance, Joe?" I inquired. "I were," said Joe with emphasis and solemnity. "Was there a great sensation?" "Why," said Joe, "yes, there certainly were a peck of orange peel, particularly when he saw the ghost, though I put it to yourself, sir, whether it's calculated to keep a man up to his work with a good heart to be continually cutting in twixt him and the ghost by saying Amen. A man may have a misfortune and been in the church," said Joe, lowering his voice to an argumentative and feeling tone, But that's no reason why you should put him out for such a time. Why, I mean to say, if the ghost of a man's father can't be allowed to claim his attention, what can? Still more when his mourning hat has made unfortunately so small that the weight of the black feathers brings it off, try to keep it on as he may. A ghost-seeing effect in Joe's own countenance informed me that Herbert had entered the room. So I presented Joe to Herbert, who held out his hand, but Joe backed from it and held on to the bird's nest. "Your servant, sir," said Joe, "which I hope as you and Pip—" Here his eye fell on the Avenger, who was putting some toast on the table, and so plainly denoted it an intention to make that young gentleman one of the family that I frowned it down and confused him more. "I mean to say, you two gentlemen, which I hope as you get your healths in this close spot. For the present way may be a very good inn, according to London opinions," said Joe confidentially, "and I believe its character do stand it, but I wouldn't keep a pig in it myself, not in the case I wished him to fatten wholesome and eat with a mellow flavour on 'em." Having borne this flattering testimony to the merits of our dwelling place, and having incidentally shown this tendency to call me sir, Joe, being invited to sit down at the table, looked all around the room for a suitable spot on which to deposit his hat, as if it were only on some very rare substance in nature that it would find a resting place, and ultimately stood it on the extreme corner of the chimney-piece, from which it ever afterwards fell off at intervals. Do you take tea or coffee, Mr. Gargery?" asked Herbert, who was always presided of a morning. "Thank ye, sir," said Joe, stiff from head to foot. "I'll take whichever is most agreeable to yourself. What do you say to coffee?" "Thank ye, sir," returned Joe, evidently dispirited by the proposal. "Since you are so kind as to make this choice of coffee, I will not run contrary to your opinions. But don't you find it a little heating to the body?" "Say tea, then," said Herbert, pouring it out. Here Joe's hat tumbled off the mantelpiece, and he started out of his chair and picked it up and fixed it to exactly the same spot, as if it were an absolute point of good breeding that it should tumble off again soon. "When did you come to town, Mr. Gargery?" "Were it yesterday afternoon?" said Joe, after coughing behind his hand, as if he'd had time to catch the whooping cough since he came. "No, it were not. Yes, it were. Yes, it were yesterday afternoon," with an appearance of mingled wisdom, relief, and strict impartiality. "Have you seen anything of London yet?" "Why, yes, sir," said Joe. "Me and Wopsle went off straight to look at the Black and Warehouse." That is the warehouse where black leather shoes were made. "But we didn't find it come up to its likeness in the red bills on the shop doors, which I mean to say," added Joe in an explanatory manner, "that it was read to architecture. I really believe Joe would have prolonged this last word, mightily expressive in my mind of some architecture that I know, into a perfect chorus, but for his attention being providentially attracted by his hat, which was toppling. Indeed, it demanded from him a constant attention, and a quickness of eye and hand very much like that exacted by wicket-keeping. He made extraordinary play with it, and showed the greatest skill in rushing at it and catching it nearly as it dropped, now merely stopping it midway, beating it up and humouring it in various parts of the room and against a good deal of the pattern of the wallpaper, before it fell safe close to it, finally splashing it into the slop basin, where I took the liberty of laying hands upon it. As to his shirt collar, his coat collar, they were perplexing to reflect upon, insoluble mysteries both. Why should a man scrape himself to that extent before he could consider himself fully dressed? Why should he suppose it necessary to be purified by suffering for his holiday clothes? Then he fell into such unaccountable fits of meditation, with his fork midway between his plate and his mouth, and had his eyes distracted in such strange directions, was afflicted with such remarkable coughs, sat so far from the table and dropped so much more than he ate, and pretended that he hadn't dropped it, that I was heartily glad when Herbert left us for the city. I had neither the good sense nor the good feeling to know that this was all my fault, and that if I had been easier with Joe, Joe would have been easier with me. I felt impatient of him and out of temper with him, in which condition he heaped coals of fire upon my head. "Us two being now alone, sir," began Joe. "Joe!" I interrupted pettishly. "How can you call me sir?" Joe looked at me for a single instant with something faintly like reproach. Utterly preposterous as was his cravat, as his collars were, I was conscious of a sort of dignity in that look. "Us two now being alone," resumed Joe, "and me having the intention and abilities to stay not many minutes more, I will now conclude, leastways begin, to mention what have led to having my this present honour. For was it not," said Joe, with his old air of lucid exposition, "that my only wish was to be useful to you, I should not have had the honour of breaking victuals in the company and abode of gentlemen." I was so unwilling to see the look again that I made no remonstrance against this tone. "Well, sir," pursued Joe, "this is how it were. I were at the Bargeman t'other night, Pip." Whenever he subsided into affection he called me Pip, and whenever he relapsed into politeness he called me sir. "When there came up in his shay cart Pumblechook, which the same identical," said Joe, going down a new track, "do come my hair in the wrong way sometimes awful, by giving out up and down town as it were him which ever had your infant companionation, and were looked upon as a playfellow by yourself." "Oh, nonsense! It was you, Joe." "Which I fully believed it were, Pip," said Joe, slightly tossing his head, "though it signified little now, sir. Well, Pip, this same identical, which his manners is given to blusterous, come to me at the Bargeman. What a pint and a pint of beer do give refreshment to a working man, sir, and do not overstimulate. And his words were, 'Joseph, Miss Havisham, she do wish to speak with you.'" "Miss Havisham, Joe?" "She wish," were Pumblechook's words, "to speak with you," said Joe, and sat and rolled his eyes at the ceiling. "Yes, Joe, go on, please." "Next day, sir," said Joe, looking at me as if he was a long way off, "having cleaned myself, I go and I see Miss A." "Miss A, Joe? Miss Havisham?" "Which I say, sir," replied Joe, with an air of legal formality, as if he were making his will. "Miss A, or otherwise Havisham, her expression here then as following: 'Mr. Gargery, You are in correspondence with Mr. Pip? Hadn't had a letter from you, I were able to say I am. When I married your sister, sir, I said I will. And when I answered your friend Pip, I said I am. Well, would you tell him then, said she, that which Estella has come home and would be glad to see him? I felt my face fire up as I looked at Joe. I hope one remote cause of its figure may be the consciousness that if I had known his errand, I should have given him much more encouragement. Biddy, pursued Joe, when I got home, asked her for to write this message, but she hung back. Yes, she hung back a little. She said, I know he will be very glad to have it by word of mouth. As it's holiday time, you want to see him? Go. I have now concluded, sir, said Joe, rising from his chair. And Pip, I wish you ever well and ever prospering to greater and greater heights. But you're not going now, Joe. Yes, I am, said Joe. But are you not coming back to dinner, Joe? No, I am not, said Joe. Our eyes met again, and all the sir melted out of this manly heart as he gave me his hand. Pip, dear old chap, life is made of ever so many partings welded together, as you may say. And one man's a blacksmith, and one's a whitesmith, and one's a goldsmith, and one's a coppersmith. Divisions must come and must be met as they come. If there's been any fault today, it's all mine. You and me is not two figures to be together in London, not when anywheres else but what is private and beknown and understood among friends. It ain't that I'm proud, but that I want to be right. As you shall ever see me no more in these clothes. I'm wrong in these clothes. I'm wrong out of the forge, or out of the kitchen, or off the marshes. You won't find half so much fault in me if you think of me in my forge dress, with my hammer in my hand, or even my pipe. You won't find half as much fault in me if, supposing have you said you should ever wish to see me again, you come and put your head in at the forge window and see Joe the blacksmith there with his hand at the old anvil and the old burnt apron sticking to the old work. I'm awful dull, but I hope I beat out something nigh the rights of it at last. And so, God bless you, dear old chap, Pip, old chap. God bless you. If I had not been mistaken in my fancy that there was a simple dignity in him, of course there was. The fashion of his dress could no more come in its way when he spoke these words than it could have come in his way in heaven. He touched me gently on the forehead and went out. As soon as I could recover myself sufficiently, I hurried out after him and looked for him in the neighbouring streets. But he was gone,